The death of Diane and Alan Johnson sent shockwaves through their tranquil community. On September 2, 2003, the Blaine County Sheriff's Office responded to a harrowing 911 call from Kim Richards. Kim reported that her neighbor's 16-year-old daughter, Sarah Johnson, had run to her door screaming that her parents, 52-year-old Diane and 46-year-old Alan Scott Johnson, had been murdered. Officers and first responders promptly arrived at the scene. Upon entering the house, they encountered a gruesome sight. Diane was found in bed with a fatal gunshot wound to the head, seemingly killed in her sleep. Blood splattered the walls and ceiling near the headboard, and a fragment of her skull lay on the floor. Nearby, Alan's body was discovered lying on the floor beside Diane's side of the bed. He wore only a towel, and blood pooled beneath him. Initially, investigators suspected a murder-suicide, but as they examined the scene more closely, their theory shifted. Following a blood trail to the ensuite bathroom, they heard water running and found the shower left on. When they turned off the water, they noticed blood spatter and a bullet hole in the shower wall. Investigators searched the house for further evidence. In the bedroom, they found what appeared to be the murder weapon, a .264 caliber Winchester rifle. 2 kitchen knives lay at the foot of Diane's bed, and another knife was discovered on the bed belonging to the couple's son, Matt. The clues at the scene puzzled investigators. There was no sign of forced entry, as it was noted that the Johnsons didn't lock the doors, a fact that only those close to the family would know. The house hadn't been ransacked as one would expect from a possible robbery gone wrong. Officers at the scene questioned Sarah as to what she remembered before she ran to her neighbor's house for help. She explained to investigators that she'd been asleep when she heard a gunshot. She ran to her parents' bedroom and called out for her mother, and that was when she heard a second gunshot. Without hesitation, Sarah ran to a neighbor's house for help. She didn't see the intruder. The statement was corroborated by the neighbor who called 911, Kim Richards. On the property was a guest house which had been rented out to a close friend of Alan's, 45-year-old Mel Spiegel. Investigators entered the house and found a rather incriminating piece of evidence on the bed, the scope belonging to the same rifle found at the crime scene. However, Mel was nowhere to be found. His convenient disappearance had made him a possible person of interest for investigators. The entire property was sealed off on the orders of lead investigator Sergeant Walt Pemling. He also told officers to stop the waste disposal truck from removing any trash cans from the property. The theory was that Mel may have had an altercation with Alan and Diane and killed them in the heat of the moment. As they worked through this theory, forensics teams searched through the trash cans and discovered even more evidence. Inside, they found a pink bathrobe that had been bundled up. Once crime scene technicians opened the bathrobe, they found a latex glove, a single brown leather glove that matched the one found in the Johnsons' bedroom, and ammunition for a .25 caliber gun. All the evidence was tied and sent off for DNA testing while investigators developed their own scenario. It was now becoming clear to investigators that whomever killed the couple knew about the unlocked doors and the day the trash was removed. It was possible the killer threw the evidence in the trash before fleeing the scene. It was time to call in Mel Spiegel. Hours after the double homicide, sheriff's deputies received news that Mel Spiegel had been found in Boise, Idaho. Mel agreed to speak with investigators and met them at the police station in Boise. Investigators asked Mel about his whereabouts that morning. Mel said he spent the weekend with his family and was planning to return to Bellevue in a week. Investigators contacted Mel's family members who confirmed his alibi. Mel was asked about his relationship with Alan and Diane. He told officers that he'd been renting the guest house from the couple for years, and he showed a very good and close relationship with them. When asked about the rifle used in the murders, Mel admitted that it did belong to him. However, he said it had been locked away in his closet before he left for Boise over the weekend. Investigators then asked Mel about anyone he believed that may have made enemies with the couple. Mel revealed that Alan and Diane were starting to grow worried about their daughter, Sarah. She'd started dating a 19-year-old boy named Bruno Santos. From what Mel had heard, Bruno was living in the country illegally and selling drugs to make a living. It was a bit of a stretch for investigators, but now urged them to speak to other family members. Investigators did just that and started to put together a picture of the Johnson family. Alan and Diane met in the early 1980s. Diane had been in a relationship before meeting Alan and had a toddler son named Matt. The pair married in 1983, and Alan adopted Matt as his own son. They moved into a beautiful home in the quiet city of Bellevue, Idaho, and in making 87, welcomed their daughter Sarah Marie Johnson into the world on January 25, 1987. Alan was the co-owner of a landscaping firm in Bellevue and Diane worked as a tax collector. Together, they made a beautiful home for their 2 children and were, by all accounts, a loving family. The couple were also well known in their community as Alan was an avid trap shooter, a common pastime for many in the community. In 2003, their family life had seemed harmonious to outsiders. Matt, who was 22 years old at the time, was away studying at the University of Idaho in Moscow, Idaho. Sarah had also been doing well at school and was part of her school's volleyball team. She was also the apple of Alan's eye. But investigators were about to uncover the family tensions that had started arising in the previous few months. Having cleared Mel was a possible suspect, investigators took his advice and returned to Bellevue to speak with family members. As expected, everyone knew the Johnsons to be a happy and loving family. Investigators interviewed their son, Matt, who had returned from university, as well as Diane's sister and brother-in-law, Linda and Jim Faveld. All 3 said that the family life appeared to be happy and normal. That was until Sarah met Bruno Santos. Matt, Linda, and Jim all agreed that Sarah dating Bruno had become a major point of contention in the family. Over the few months leading up to the murder, tensions had gotten worse within the household. But being a teenager, Sarah naturally rebelled against her parents' rules. Even when her parents forbid Sarah from seeing Bruno again, she continued to defy them. However, Jim revealed information to the investigators that could possibly have given Bruno a reason to murder Diane and Alan. Days before the murders, Alan and Diane had discovered that Sarah had been lying about spending the night at a female friend's house. Sarah had spent the night with Bruno instead. Alan called Jim and told him what happened. Alan then asked Jim to come with him to confront Bruno. Jim told investigators that Alan was furious and threatened to report Bruno to police for assaulting Sarah. She was underage. The 2 men then left with Sarah. A charge of such a serious nature could spell deportation for Bruno. After listening to what Jim had revealed, investigators believed that this was motive enough for Bruno to eliminate the Johnsons. It was time to speak to Bruno Santos. County police were familiar with Bruno Santos. He was a high school dropout and had been involved in a few minor drug-related crimes. When he was taken in for questioning, he became confrontational with investigators. During his interview, he was arrogant and hurt to deal with, according to investigators. He then told investigators that he proposed to Sarah and that she'd accept it. Investigators bully you that he'd said thus to prove that he loved Sarah and wouldn't have done anything to jeopardize their relationship. When investigators asked him about his whereabouts on the morning of the murders, Bruno said that he was asleep on the couch at his home. He told officers to contact his mother, who confirmed that she'd been at home with him. For investigators, this was still not a strong alibi. When investigators asked Bruno about Alan and Diane, his attitude towards the Johnsons was obvious. He wasn't a fan of the couple. Back at the Johnsons' house, forensic teams were collecting evidence from the entire home. They'd used a UV light to comb through every part of the house for possible blood evidence that could indicate an escape route taken by the killer. While searching Sarah's room, they found blood splatter and bone fragments on a wall in Sarah's room. This discovery only added to the mystery of the shooting. The blood and bone were sent to the lab for testing. This discovery had investigators questioning if Sarah was being honest about what she really saw that morning. The search of the room led investigators to even more evidence. A single brown leather glove, the same one that was found bundled up in the trash. A key to the guest house and unspent .264 caliber shells were also found in Sarah's room. On one of the unspent shells was tissue matter possibly transferred from the glove when the killer tried to hide evidence. This too was sent to forensics for testing. Investigators now believe that Bruno may have killed Sarah's parents and went to her to help him get rid of the evidence. investigators served Bruno and his mother with a search warrant to collect evidence from the house. All the clothes he wore in that day, including his shoes, were taken in for testing. His fingerprints were also taken to test against any found at the crime scene. Bruno was taken to the hospital where a DNA sample was taken for testing. Hair clippings and hand scrapings were also collected for evidence. Bruno was announced as the prime suspect in the murders of Alan and Diane Johnson. However, investigators were about to receive information that was going to take the investigation in a completely unexpected direction. Having thoroughly tested the clothes and shoes taken from Bruno, forensic experts couldn't find any trace of blood belonging to either Diane or Alan. At the actual crime scene, there were no traces of DNA, hairs, or fingerprints found anywhere near the bodies of Alan or Diane, nor was there any physical evidence that placed Bruno in the couple's room. The tests done on the gloves and bathrobe also came back with a negative result. Investigators were stumped. They were sure that Bruno had the most reason to kill both Alan and Diane. However, the complete lack of physical evidence that should have placed Bruno at the scene suggested he was telling them the truth. Bruno was eventually eliminated as a suspect in the case. As they looked at the case closely, their minds started to shift to someone else. Investigators began questioning Sarah's family and friends more intensely about her home and personal life. They come to discover that Sarah had been prescribed antidepressants and that her relationship with her parents was rocky at best. Family members said that they brushed off her behavior as being normal for a teenager. Sarah, they believed, was at the age when most children start to become rebellious and push against their parents' authority. But Linda, Sarah's aunt, started to grow suspicious with her niece's behavior. She told investigators that Sarah was not going through the normal grieving process. Linda said that Sarah showed more interest in returning to school. Investigators then turned to some of Sarah's friends and asked them about her behavior since the death of her parents. They all agreed that Sarah was acting indifferent to the murders. They also told investigators that she seemed more interested in getting her nails painted. The one thing that stood out for them, though, was Sarah being more concerned for Bruno since his arrest. It was odd to them that Sarah was concerned rather than angry with her parents' alleged killer. Investigators didn't want to believe where their thoughts were taking them, as it was too horrible to imagine. But they had no choice except to look into Sarah as a possible suspect. The Johnsons' home was still an active crime scene, and now investigators were treating Sarah's room as a second area of interest. Investigators at the scene were now questioning how the blood splatter had reached that far. A gun expert was called to the house to take a closer look at the spatter pattern. After analyzing the direction from Alan and Diane's room to Sarah's, the gun expert concluded that both bedroom doors were open at the time of the shooting. Investigators had also called plumbers to the scene after clogging was reported in one of the bathroom toilets. The source of the clog appeared to be a shower cap. Investigators decided to interview Linda, Matt, and Mel Spiegel regarding some of the evidence they discovered. Matt and Linda both identified the pink bathrobe as belonging to Sarah. Mel confirmed that Sarah had a key to the guest house and often helped him clean up the place. He also told investigators that Sarah was aware of the gun that was kept in the closet. Investigators now needed to be able to link Sarah to all the evidence, but that was going to prove difficult as eyewitnesses on the morning of the murders said that Sarah didn't have any traces of blood on her when she ran to a neighbor's house begging for help. This was also confirmed by forensics experts who used a luminol to test for any blood splatter on Sarah's clothes and found nothing at all. Investigators issued a warrant to confiscate and test the clothes Sarah had been wearing in the morning. Meanwhile, investigators wanted to speak to Sarah again and see if her story had changed since they last spoke to her. Investigators once again called Sarah in for an interview. She'd been staying with her aunt and uncle. Small inconsistencies were noted in Sarah's story. Overall, investigators found that her story had changed at least 5 different times. In some explanations, she said she was asleep and woke up to the sound of a gunshot. In another, she said she'd been awake when she heard the first gunshot. Another time she told investigators that she was still in her room when she heard the second gunshot, but once again changed her story and said she was outside her parents' bedroom when the second shot was fired. Sarah also had a hard time to remember if her parents' room door was open or closed at the time of the shooting. Investigators remained calm when questioning Sarah to avoid her picking up on their suspicions. They'd already been made aware that both bedroom doors were open, and that was the only explanation for the blood splatter on Sarah's bedroom wall. Sarah was asked to submit a DNA sample, hair samples, and hand scrapings as part of the investigation to clear her name. These were all sent for testing during the lab. The pajama top and bottom that Sarah was using on the morning of the murders were sent to the lab to be tested by forensic specialist Rod Englert. Under a high-powered microscope, Englert found no traces of blood on the front of the robe. However, on the back of the garment, he found patterns of high-velocity blood splatter. He also found blue cotton fibers and green specks of paint on the inside of the robe that matched the shirt worn by Sarah that morning. But the smoking gun moment was yet to come. Lab results had also confirmed that Sarah's DNA was found on the inner lining of the latex glove and gun residue on both pairs of the brown leather glove. The blood found on the gloves and robe belonged to both Alan and Diane. This was more than enough for investigators to arrest and charge Sarah with the double homicide of Alan and Diane Johnson. On October 29, 2003, Sarah Johnson was arrested for the murders of her parents, Helen and Diane Johnson. She was held without bail at the Blaine County Jail awaiting trial. The story of a teenage girl murdering her parents made headlines nationally and became a media sensation. Investigators and prosecutors had to develop a plausible argument that showed Sarah was motivated and capable of committing such a heinous crime. Relying on statements from family members and friends of both Sarah and her parents, they started to put together a twisted tale of a teenager in the throes of passion. Since Sarah had started dating Bruno, her parents had disapproved of the relationship. As a result, Sarah started to sneak around behind her parents' bags and acted out as any normal teenager would. However, the trigger for Sarah happened a few days before the murders. She'd lied to her parents about staying with a friend when in fact she was staying with Bruno. Her father's threats to have Bruno charged with assault and deported to Mexico pushed Sarah over the edge. Investigators and prosecutors believe that this was the moment Sarah had concocted the plan to get rid of her parents and live a happy life with Bruno. Being a fan of true crime and murder mysteries, Sarah believed that she had the perfect plot in place. On the morning of the murders, she got up and went to the guest house to retrieve the rifle. She then put on latex gloves, leather gloves, a shower cap to avoid blood splatter on her hair, and her bathrobe backwards to avoid any blood touching her clothes. Sarah then went to her parents' room when she heard her father get into the shower. She shot Diane in the head while she slept. Sarah then heard her father, Alan, call out and open the bathroom door and shot him in the chest. After committing the murders, she placed knives in the bedrooms to stage the scene as if an intruder killed her pants. She then bundled up the evidence and threw it away in the trash, knowing the waste disposal company would pick up the evidence before investigators could find it. However, that didn't go to plan. Added to that, she didn't take into account the evidence that would be found in her room and the shower cap that had gotten lodged in the plumbing system. The evidence against Sarah was glaring, and it was time to go to trial. In February 2005, 2 years after her parents' murders, her defense team argued that Sarah was innocent and that her parents were murdered by an intruder. The prosecution, though, were ready with their argument. They presented the court with the physical evidence found at the crime scene and testimonies from family and friends that showed Sarah's behavior was strange since her parents were both killed. Most damning of all was the testimony of Bruno Santos, who not only wanted to clear himself of the murder at the trial, but provided the jury with evidence of Sarah's state of mind before the murders. Bruno testified that he and Sarah had agreed to get married, and Sarah had even told them that they could live in a big, beautiful house and be happy with just each other. Bruno also told the court that Sarah always spoke about how much she hated her dad and talked about shooting him. After 5 weeks of testimonies, proof of evidence, and crime scene explanations, the jury had come to a decision on March 16, 2005. Sarah, aged 18, was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole to the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center in Idaho. Sarah has since made several appeals to have her life sentence reduced. However, all her appeals have been denied and she still remains in custody. Following Sarah's sentencing, the remaining family members have spoken out publicly about their feelings towards Sarah and her actions. The deaths of Alan and Diane have devastated their family entirely. The majority feel that Sarah was at fault and assert the punishment she received. Sarah's brother, Matt, believed that Sarah showed no remorse for murdering their parents. He said that if she were ever given a second chance, she'd do a better job with the murders to avoid being caught. Pat Dishman, Diane's mother, spoke to Sarah during her sentencing hearing. She told her granddaughter that they still loved her, but that her actions had devastated their entire family. Awan's sister, Lynn Murrell, said that Sarah was spoiled and rotten and was capable of murdering another person if she was ever released. She asked the judge to consider never releasing her from prison. Today's case was one of a truly twisted and disturbing nature. To be capable of murdering one's own parents proved that Sarah Johnson only thought about herself and not of the devastation she caused for her brother and family. While they're left behind to pick up the pieces, Sarah remains behind bars for her senseless crime. Kristen Rossum's story is one of a brilliant mind derailed by destructive choices. A chemistry graduate from San Diego State University with promising prospects, Kristen now serves a life sentence at the Central California Women's Facility for the murder of her husband. Raised in a highly accomplished family, Kristen was one of 3 children of Ralph and Constance Rossum. The Rossums invested heavily in their children's futures, enrolling them in elite schools, providing tutoring, and fostering their talents through extracurricular activities. However, Kristen, impulsive and fragile, struggled to meet the high expectations placed on her. Her struggles led her to deception, truancy, and, eventually, substance abuse. Seeking escape from reality, Kristen initially turned to alcohol, but when it failed to provide solace, she became dependent on methamphetamine, the most addictive illicit drug in the U.S., known for causing paranoia, euphoria, hallucinations, and impaired judgment. Kristen's increasingly erratic behavior alarmed her parents, and after much probing, she confessed to her addiction, which had begun in high school. This revelation was devastating for her family of academically accomplished professionals. Tensions escalated, and at just 17 years old, Kristen ran away to Mexico with friends. During her time in Mexico, she met Gregory DeVille, a tall and charismatic man 7 years her senior. Greg became a stabilizing force in her life, falling in love with her and taking on a protective, almost parental role. With his support, Kristen began to rebuild her life and secured a job as a toxicology assistant at a local forensic department, offering a glimpse of the promising career she once seemed destined for. Her skills impressed the employer. Her addiction was forgotten, which worked in her favor as her job in toxicology provided access to seized controlled substances. As a forensic assistant, Kristen graduated from university with honors. Her teachers and employer praised her, handing her the Best Student Award, unaware of the reasons for her love of the chosen profession. Her relationship with Greg lasted about 5 years and ended with a grand wedding on June 5, 1999. Kristen's parents adored Greg and were at ease for their daughter as she had climbed out of the pit of dependency and confidently stood on the road to a promising and happy life. In March 2000, Kristen was hired by the San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office as a toxicologist. A toxicologist analyzes body fluids to detect controlled substances. Gregory was working in the biotechnology industry at the time. Kristen quickly grew bored with her monotonous life and began seeking excitement elsewhere. She found an opportunity with a new colleague, Michael Robertson, who had been appointed as the department head. He was married, but that didn't stop a sudden infatuation between them. They couldn't keep their relationship secret for long. Greg found numerous letters exchanged between the secret lovers. The marital relationship deteriorated, but Gregory still hoped to save the marriage, knowing his wife's weaknesses and trying as hard as ever to save her. This time, Kristen didn't want to be saved. She demanded a divorce. On the morning of Monday, November 6, 2000, Kristen was getting ready for work as usual. Greg was ill and stayed home. Kristen was very worried about her husband. In the days following their separation talk, he had been lethargic and unusually calm. She informed his workplace of her husband's illness. She also visited him during her lunch break. Greg was asleep. At 9:22 p.m. that same day, Christine called emergency services to report that her husband, Greg, was not breathing. He had most likely committed suicide because he was home alone. The woman cried into the phone and did not listen to the dispatcher's instructions to examine the body and possibly administer first aid. Police officers and paramedics arriving on the scene at 10:19 p.m. pronounced Gregory de Villiers dead. He was lying on the bedroom floor with his torso exposed, surrounded by scattered rose petals. The room examination suggested that Greg most likely consumed a lethal dose of several controlled substances. Empty vials of powerful painkillers were scattered around, and torn wedding photos were found on his bed. During the interrogation, Kristen stated that she had informed her husband of their separation the previous evening. Just 17 months after the wedding, she regretted getting married. She felt she had rushed into it. Greg was too clingy, and she wanted to distance herself. Greg's death was ruled a suicide. The cause of death was strong sedative drugs. Kristen signed the cremation papers. However, Gregory's family and friends refused to believe in such a sudden suicide. None of them noticed any changes in his character or mood. He had not shared his marital problems with anyone. Greg was so opposed to controlled substances that he would never have taken them. Soon, the relatives managed to stop the cremation and insisted on an independent autopsy. The family's persistence allowed for the consideration of a homicide scenario. Soon, toxicological tests revealed that Gregory's body contained an extremely high amount of phenyl, a pain reliever 150 times stronger than morphine, along with lesser amounts of clonazepam and trace amounts of oxycodone known as hillbilly heroin. Investigators speculated that, under the strong influence of clonazepam and other detected drugs, someone else administered the lethal dose of fentanyl to Gregory. Kristen became the prime suspect as fentanyl is not an over-the-counter medication, and she had ample knowledge and access to such drugs. Upon arrival for interrogation at the police station, Kristen's emaciated, unattractive appearance and her doping behavior indicated her drug dependency. This was confirmed by her own statements on the day of Gregory's death. Kristen was inconsistent in her accounts. Initially, Kristen told paramedics that Gregory had not taken any medication, but later she changed her statement suggesting he might have taken oxycodone. At the hospital, Kristen told a nurse that Gregory might have overdosed on oxycodone. Oxycodone is similar in effect to codeine-based drugs. It can not only relieve pain, but also induce a sense of euphoria. It depresses the respiratory center, and without timely assistance, its use can be fatal. The police considered the possibility that Gregory died from an accidental overdose of cold medicine and oxycodone. In conversations with Kristen, they also learned that Gregory was very upset about their failing marriage, leading Kristen to tell the police that he ended his own life. This was another investigative avenue they explored. On November 8th, a colleague of Kristen's, Russ Lowe, called the police. He informed them about Kristen's affair with her boss. This information shifted the course of the police investigation. Evidence of Kristen's connection with her boss, Dr. Robertson, was found. The evidence included passionate emails they exchanged as well as computer files and professional articles revealing Dr. Robertson's specialized knowledge of fentanyl. The criminal puzzle was coming together perfectly. It was suspected that Gregory became a threat to the lovers as he knew that Kristen, with her access to the lab and controlled substances, was secretly using them and Michael was covering for her. It was a premeditated crime. The challenge for the investigators was to prove it. During interrogation, Michael Robertson told detectives that he was aware of his lover's drug dependency. At that time, no charges were brought against the couple. They were both dismissed from their jobs for violating several rules during the investigation. Serious trouble for Kristen began in January when police raided her home, finding traces of drugs and paraphernalia. She was arrested for the first time but was later released on bail. The investigation progressed as new information emerged. This included Kristen's diary. During its initial examination, investigators hypothesized that it was written by Kristen not for herself, but for an external reader as a means of covering up and affirming her innocence while crafting the appearance of Gregory's perfect self-inflicted demise. On the day of her husband's death, she bought a rose in revealing lingerie actions inconsistent with her distressed demeanor. Medical examination indicated that Gregory was unconscious for at least 6 hours before his passing, and his death could have occurred an hour or an hour and a half before it was confirmed. Additionally, a bruise around a needle injection site on the young man's arm was found, its purpose and executor unexplained. At Kristen's workplace, a shortage of the drug that led to Gregory's demise, as well as other controlled substances, was discovered. Police believed Kristen poisoned Gregory, administering fentanyl without his knowledge. The prosecution built its case on toxicological and medical data. With enough circumstantial evidence, Kristen was arrested on June 25, 2001 and charged with first-degree murder. After spending 6 months in custody, she was released on bail. The first trial soon commenced. The prosecution's main theory was the motive for the homicide. They argued that she terminated Gregory because he threatened to tarnish her good girl reputation by revealing her renewed drug use and affair with Michael Robertson. The prosecution claimed Kristen poisoned Gregory with fentanyl. The court heard that fentanyl is a powerful synthetic opioid 80 times stronger than morphine. It was suggested that she first tried to end his life with clonazepam, but when that failed, she administered fentanyl. They also argued that she then staged the bedroom to look like Gregory ended his own life, tearing pages from her diary and placing rose petals and a wedding photo around his body. The court heard that Kristen, with a degree in biochemistry, used her knowledge of drugs and chemistry to terminate Gregory. The prosecution also claimed that Kristen hoped to convince her colleagues in the medical examiner's office that Gregory's death was self-inflicted, hiding information about the fentanyl. However, before Gregory's autopsy could be conducted, she was transferred to another lab, and the attempt to substitute toxicological research was unsuccessful. The prosecution presented Kristen's day on November 6th. Early in the morning, she called Gregory's employer to report his absence, then went to work. Her colleagues testified that about an hour after she arrived at work around 9 a.m., she was seen crying in Michael's office. The apartment building manager where Kristen and Gregory lived reported seeing her return home at 12:10 p.m. At 12:41 p.m., she went to a local grocery store and purchased several items, including a single red rose. Credit card statements confirm this fact. Hours before Gregory's demise, she made multiple calls to Michael. Dr. Brian Blackburn, the San Diego County medical examiner who conducted Gregory's autopsy, testified that Gregory had been deceased for at least an hour before the paramedics arrived. He informed the court that Gregory developed early bronchial pneumonia. This condition arises when secretions, normally expelled through breathing, accumulate in the lungs because a person is either unconscious or not breathing deeply enough. Dr. Blackburn also informed the court that Gregory's bladder contained a significant amount of urine, which would have been very uncomfortable had he been conscious. This led Dr. Blackburn to conclude that Gregory was breathing poorly for approximately 6 to 12 hours before his death. A person in an unconscious state would not be able to sprinkle rose petals over themselves. Dr. Blackburn showed that the level of clonazepam found in Gregory's blood was not at an overdose level and was not lethal. Dr. Theodore Stanley testified on behalf of the prosecution. He demonstrated that fentanyl is a potent and fast-acting pain reliever with a serious side effect that can lead to a person's respiratory arrest. Dr. Stanley stated that the speed at which fentanyl begins to act depends on the method of its administration. The peak effect occurs about 16 hours after applying a transdermal patch, 20 to 30 minutes after oral ingestion, 15 to 20 minutes after intramuscular injection, and within 5 minutes after intravenous injection. Dr. Stanley informed the court that fentanyl is usually not administered orally because the liver destroys about 65% of it, so only 35% enters the bloodstream. When asked to explain how fentanyl entered Gregory's system, neither Dr. Blackburn nor Dr. Stanley could provide a definitive opinion. Dr. Stanley showed that various concentration levels in Gregory's body, along with data indicating that Gregory was unconscious and breathing shallowly for several hours before his death, suggests that fentanyl was likely administered to Gregory multiple times. The prosecution could not confidently tell the jury how Kristen poisoned Gregory, but there were indications that she might have applied fentanyl patches to his arm while he was asleep. The disappearance of 15 patches from the laboratory where Kristen formerly worked supported this theory as a possibility. The defense asserted Kristen's innocence, acknowledging that fentanyl was the cause of Gregory's death, but claimed he self-administered it. intentionally causing his own demise due to despair over family issues. Kristen testified in court, describing waking up on the morning of November 6th to find Gregory distraught. She called his employer at 7:42 a.m. to report his illness and that he wouldn't be coming to work. She told the court she went to work, but returned to the apartment to check on Gregory, having lunch with him after noon. Christine's testimony. I asked Gregory why he was so upset that morning. He replied that he wasn't feeling well and had taken some oxycodone and clonazepam. He planned to stay home and sleep. I left for work. Around 2:30 in the afternoon during my lunch break, I came home to check on Gregory. We had lunch. I then went back to work. I got home around 8 o'clock in the evening. Gregory was lying on the bed. I thought he was asleep. I took a bath. When I came out, I tried to wake him up. He was cold. I called the emergency services. The prosecutor cross-examined Kristen, calling her explanation strange. She admitted to lying in the past and about her drug use. He told the court that fentanyl was the perfect poison because it's hard to detect, which she knew well from her job. Medical testimony based on autopsy and toxicological findings proved that Gregory was unconscious for about 6-8 hours, meaning Kristen couldn't have had lunch with her husband that day. The defense claimed that although Dr. Blackburn showed the clonazepam level in Gregory's blood wasn't lethal, taking oxycodone, an opioid, and clonazepam, a benzodiazepine, together could create a synergistic effect, making them more potent. They suggested Gregory might have unknowingly taken the drugs himself. How fentanyl was administered and why high levels were found in his system remained unexplained. After 8 hours of deliberation, the jury found Kristen guilty of first-degree homicide and special circumstances homicide due to the use of poison. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Kristen maintained her innocence and appealed the verdict. The appellate court heard that errors were made by her own defense team. Her lawyers admitted fentanyl caused the death, but failed to test autopsy samples for fentanyl metabolites. This test could have determined whether Gregory swallowed fentanyl or if the fentanyl found in the samples was a result of laboratory contamination after his death. If fentanyl had been detected only in the samples and never in Gregory's body, the prosecution's theory that fentanyl caused his death would have been incorrect. The appellate court heard that there was a break in the chain of custody regarding the samples. They were placed in a cardboard box with each container marked as a sample from Gregory's body, but the containers weren't sealed. They were supposed to be delivered to the sheriff's office for immediate transfer to an external lab, but the person supposed to receive the samples was absent, so the box remained at the medical examiner's office for about 36 hours before being delivered to the sheriff's forensic lab. The appellate court's argument was that anyone with a key to the medical examiner's office building had access to the samples. Fentanyl could have been added to the samples posthumously. Kristen believed there was a motive to tamper with the samples and frame her for the crime due to various personal relationships and tensions among the staff. Indeed, Kristen argued in the appellate court that on November 8, 2000, Michael informed one of the toxicologists that he had examined a sample of Gregory's stomach contents. The three-judge panel of the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals concluded that Kristen's lawyers erred in not contesting the prosecution's claim that her husband died from a fentanyl overdose. They stated that her legal team should have tested the autopsy samples for fentanyl metabolites rather than just admitting he died in such a manner. However, they did not overturn the verdict, but sent the case back to federal court to determine if this defense error could have altered the trial's outcome. After this decision, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that federal courts must adhere to the state court's decision when considering such appeals. Based on this ruling, the appellate court voted against holding a hearing on Kristen's case. Her appeal was denied, and she remains in custody. Michael Robertson was implicated as an accomplice in Kristen's trial. Authorities discreetly filed a criminal conspiracy complaint and issued a sealed warrant for the arrest of Michael Robertson, the former boss and lover of convicted perpetrator Kristen Rossum. Robertson, who lives freely and works as a forensic toxicology consultant in Australia since Rossum's husband's demise in 2000, could be arrested and held on $100,000 bail if he ever returns to the United States. Gregory's family filed a lawsuit accusing the county of negligence that allowed Kristen to steal a lethal dose of drugs from the medical examiner's office undetected. In 2006, A U.S. court awarded them $147 million in civil damages. In a case that continues to captivate the nation, Rossum, a former toxicologist at the county medical examiner's office, was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole in February 2003 for stealing drugs from the lab and using them to poison her husband, Gregory de Villers, staging a suicide scene in their apartment, scattering his body with red rose petals. Jesse Galganov, a 22-year-old dual citizen of Canada and the United States, hailed from Montreal and pursued higher education in the United States. A Wesleyan University graduate as of May 2017, Jesse aspired to attend medical school and become a neurosurgeon. He had been accepted to the Sidney Kimmel Medical College at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia but requested a one-year deferral to travel before embarking on his rigorous medical training. During the summer of 2017, Jesse worked 3 jobs to fund an ambitious 8-month journey across South America and Asia, set to begin on September 24, 2017, and conclude on May 15, 2018. His itinerary included traveling through South America in the fall and attending a friend's wedding in India in January, followed by time in Asia. Jesse had a return flight to Montreal scheduled for May 15, 2018, to spend time with his family before relocating to Philadelphia for medical school in July. On September 24th, Jesse's mother, Elisa Clayman, drove him to the airport, where he departed for Toronto and then connected to Lima, Peru. Initially, Jesse stayed in regular contact with family and friends, sharing updates on social media. On September 28th, he informed his mother via text that he would be out of contact for several days while trekking the Santa Cruz Trail, a popular 4-day backpacking route through Peru's Cordillera Blanca Mountains. Elisa expected to hear from Jesse by October 2nd, but no messages came. Assuming he might have taken extra time to complete the trek, she remained patient. However, as days passed without any word from Jesse, her concern grew. Jesse was normally very conscientious about keeping his mother appraised of his whereabouts and soothing her concerns about his safety while he was traveling. When Jesse had hiked the Adirondack Trail with some of his friends, he had hiked up alone to a higher altitude to try to get cell service so that he could text his mother and let her know that he was okay. Since Jesse was an adult, Elisa still tried not to panic. On October 7th, she saw a charge on her credit card from the family Apple account. Jesse had spent a $99 on an app used to track expenses. This purchase reassured Elisa, who assumed that it meant that Jesse was somewhere with a Wi-Fi signal and he was just too busy to talk to her. When another week went by with no contact from Jesse, however, Elisa could no longer sit by and wait to hear from him. On October 14th, she called Apple and asked if it would be possible to trace where the charge on 7th had been made. After several calls and transfers, she learned that Jesse had purchased the app not on October 7th, but on September 28th before he left for the mountains. The charge to the credit card had been delayed due to a technical issue. Elisa then called the Canadian embassy to report Jesse missing. She had to file a missing persons report with her local police in Canada before his case could be brought to Interpol, and she also had to report his disappearance to the FBI because of his dual citizenship. On October 17th, Elisa was in Peru. Elisa was able to make this trip due in part to a $100,000 donation made by prominent Montreal businessman Mitch Garber and his wife Anne-Marie Boucher to the effort. The couple made the donation because their son was a good friend of Jesse's from school. This donation would be the first of many made by people all over Canada and the United States to a fund created to aid in the search for Jesse. The fund is managed through the Missing Children's Network. When she arrived in Peru, Elisa was initially unable to learn much more about Jesse's movements than she had already known. On September 28th, Jesse took an overnight bus from Lima to the city of Juarez, 400 kilometers north of Lima. He had previously booked a place to stay in a hostel there, but ended up staying in a different hostel. For several weeks, this was the last place anyone knew Jesse to have been because of a Snapchat he had sent to a friend from the hostel. Elisa tried to use Jesse's devices to further track his movements. She attempted to get information from Apple because Jesse used an iPhone, Amazon because Jesse had been downloading books to a Kindle, and T-Mobile because they were Jesse's cell phone service provider. None of them would comply with the request because of privacy concerns. Alyssa had to wait for the authorities in Peru to issue subpoenas compelling them to release the information they had. 3 weeks after Jesse went missing, Apple and Amazon both released information they had on Jesse's accounts. T-Mobile claimed that they were having difficulty gathering because Jesse had been roaming internationally. Little progress seems to have ever been made in finally getting Jesse's cell records, despite Elisa's ongoing efforts. A judge has also executed on other carriers to see if Jesse's phone connected to any networks other than T-Mobile around the time he disappeared, but the order does not seem to have been complied with. Jesse's friends back home were able to use the geolocation data embedded in photos he had taken to help determine his movements. Using this information, as well as CCTV footage after a month in Peru, Elisa finally had an idea of Jesse's movements in Juarez. CCTV shows Jesse leaving his hostel at 4:30 a.m. and walking towards an area where people would gather to find communal transportation. It is unknown exactly who gave Jesse a ride, but he was dropped off at the Cacapampa entrance to Escaron National Park. There is no actual record of Jesse entering the park. Investigation would show that the individuals working at the park that day were not actual employees of the park, and the documents the park provided were both incomplete and forged. No one had actually been asked to sign in at the Cacapampa entrance to the park on the day Jesse entered it. When the park was asked for their records of who entered the park that day, they simply took the sheet from the same day in August and changed the date on it to September. They then presented the document to investigators. Hikers on the Santa Cruz track can travel in either direction along it, either going west to east or east to west. Jesse opted to travel west to east starting in Cacapampa. He had already purchased a ticket to take the bus in Vaquillera at the other end of the track. While Jesse's intentions for his hike were clear, it would be several months before anyone would be able to confirm that Jesse had ever actually made it onto the trail. Alyssa had hired a US-based private security firm the same day she had reported Jesse missing, and they sent a subcontractor from Mexico City to help her search for Jesse when she first arrived in Peru. According to Alyssa, the authorities in Peru did not have the resources to perform the search, which left the tasks up to her and the private firm. She's also claimed that the Peruvian authorities are highly corrupt, a fact which has compromised her own efforts to find Jesse. The early effort to find Jesse mainly consisted of physical searches in the mountains. Alyssa hired teams to search the trails and nearby bodies of water. She was eventually able to get helicopters to search the area for 4 days. Alyssa also hired local guides to perform glacier searches and bring in search dogs. After a month with no sign of Jesse, however, Alyssa had to change her approach. In November, Alyssa hired a new firm, Magnus International Search and Rescue, out of Israel for the next stage of the search for her son. Magnus has performed additional physical searches along the trail. They have searched waterways using a remote-operated vehicle, flown drones over the trail looking for disturbances in the soil, and spent 100 man-hours in the mountains and along the trail, finding nothing despite all of these efforts. However, the firm has made great strides on the intelligence side of the investigation using technology. Magnus scanned photographs uploaded to social media sites such as Facebook and Instagram to identify photos that had been taken on the trail at the same time Jesse had been there. They then reached out to and interviewed all of the individuals who had posted these pictures. In January 2018, they found 2 witnesses who could place Jesse on the trail. 2 Frenchmen who were on the track camped next to Jesse on the night of September 30th. They said that at that time, Jesse was dehydrated and disoriented, suffering from headaches and diarrhea. They believed that Jesse was suffering from altitude sickness, a condition that can occur in individuals who ascend to altitudes as low as 2,500 meters, depending on the environment their bodies are acclimated to. Most people who suffer from altitude sickness only experience a mild form of it. But the severe form of altitude sickness, which typically occurs at higher altitudes and in people who are ascending quickly, can result in coma and death due to pulmonary and cerebral edema. According to the French witnesses, Jesse told them that he was feeling better when he woke up on the following morning, October 1st. He looked much better as well, and he seemed to have all of the equipment he would need to complete the trek, so the witnesses were not necessarily concerned when Jesse decided to continue on his hike. They did not stay with him on the trek because they were traveling it in the opposite direction. Other hikers tracked down by Magnus International remembered seeing Jesse later in the day on October 1st because he looked so ill and was walking so slowly. As far as Magnus has been able to determine, Jesse was last seen at 3:30 p.m. on October 1st by a group of Czech backpackers. Jesse was sitting on the side of the trail approximately 1 kilometer down from Punta Union, struggling to stand up. It had taken him 8 hours to cover a distance. His mother, who was not experienced with either hiking or high altitudes, but was taking medication to combat altitude sickness and working with a guide, covered in 2 hours when she came to hike the trail during her search for Jesse. Jesse asked the group about where he could get water. This is the last known interaction Jesse had with anyone. No sign of him or any of his belongings has ever been found. The Santa Cruz trek starts out at 34,100 meters and is 47,100 meters at its highest point. The highest point on the trek is at Punta Union, near where Jesse was last seen. Jesse had not spent an extended period of time in Juarez, which is at approximately 3,000 meters before beginning the trek, which would have helped his body acclimate to being at a higher altitude. Lima, where he had spent the previous few days, sits at only 154 meters. Jesse was also traveling without a guide. Working with a guide would have helped prevent Jesse from wandering off the trail, but also may have put less physical stress on his body. Many of the local guides also drive mules up the mountain to carry hikers' backpacks. Carrying his own heavy backpack while his body was struggling to adapt to the altitude would have placed additional stress on Jesse's body and potentially made his altitude sickness worse. The fact that Jesse's condition appeared to be at its worst near the highest point of the trail seems to support the French witness concerns that he was battling altitude sickness. The Santa Cruz trek is classified as a moderate trail, a distinction that Jesse's mother has been highly critical of. Elisa argues that this classification does not convey the difficulty of the terrain or the impact altitude has on the effort involved in hiking the trail. The trail is also not well marked, and Elisa has said that she would not have successfully navigated it had she not had a guide with her. Jesse was an experienced hiker, but not necessarily prepared for what hiking this particular trail would entail. Jesse's parents divorced when he and his sister were very young. While his mother has been largely the public face of the search for Jesse and the main contact for Magnus International, Jesse's father, Todd Galganov, has also worked extensively to find his son himself. Todd spent 9.5 months in Peru looking for Jesse before returning home in October of 2018. While Elisa believed Jesse had been abducted early on in the investigation into his disappearance, she now believes it is most likely that Jesse succumbed to complications from altitude sickness based on the account given by the French hikers who camped with him. Todd, on the other hand, still fears that Jesse may have been abducted to be used for forced labor. The initial reward for information that led to Jesse was $10,000 and was eventually raised to $30,000. In October 2018, Todd Galganov raised the amount being offered to $500,000. All of these amounts are in US dollars. According to Todd, if his son is being used for labor, it is most likely by a group of people engaged in illegal activities, and such people would only respond to giant sums of money because of how valuable Jesse would be as a free worker. He also says that he is not looking to prosecute anyone who may have abducted his son and will pay the amount as ransom if it brings back Jesse. The search for Jesse has cost over $2 million to date. Elisa Clayman liquidated her financial assets and heavily mortgaged her home to cover some of these costs. But most of this money has come from contributions to Jesse's fund managed by the Missing Children's Network. Some of these contributions have been private donations, and some have been the result of fundraising efforts organized by Jesse's family. In March of 2019, Elisa Clayman organized a bazaar in Montreal, where she and volunteers sold donated items and hosted raffles. The event raised over $12,000 for the search fund. Elisa Clayman is also working to prevent other families from going through what her family has experienced. She is currently filing a civil lawsuit against Huascaran National Park for negligence and forgery, and hopes to make the park safer for future hikers who wish to locate children who go missing. While Elisa Clayman believes Jesse has passed away and her fight is to locate his body and bring him home, and Todd Galganov still believes there's a chance Jesse is alive and needs to be rescued, they both continue to fight for answers about what happened to their son. This story is about 26-year-old Elle Edwards, a vibrant and beautiful young woman from Liverpool, UK. On Christmas Eve 2022, she was celebrating with friends at a pub in Alley Village. Elle worked as a cosmetologist at a local beauty salon and also assisted a dermatologist. Her positivity and kindness endeared her to even the most demanding clients. Elle was not only skilled but also determined and cheerful, always striving toward her goals and dreams. Her infectious smile and warm personality lit up every room she entered. On December 24, 2022, Elle was especially excited because her sister, Lucy, had flown in from Dubai to spend the holidays with their family. To celebrate this joyful reunion, Elle, Lucy, and their friends decided to enjoy a night out at the local pub. The evening was filled with laughter, dancing, and karaoke. In the lively and festive atmosphere, no one noticed the presence of someone whose intentions were far from kind. Around 11:50 p.m., as the group was leaving the pub, tragedy struck. A barrage of at least 12 gunshots was fired, and 2 of them hit Elle. One bullet caused a severe head injury. Emergency services were called immediately and quickly arrived at the scene. Elle was rushed to a local hospital in an ambulance, but tragically, she succumbed to her injuries en route. Her wounds were too severe to survive. When the police informed Elle's family of the heartbreaking news, they were overcome with shock and disbelief. No one could comprehend how such a senseless act could happen to someone so full of life and kindness. Elle had no known enemies, making her death all the more incomprehensible and devastating. In the early stages of the investigation, the detectives had no leads. The assailant had attacked unexpected-like and disappeared jesters mysteriously, leaving only a shell Cassian and the bleeding victim at the crime scene. The attack was sudden but well-planned and gave Elle no chance of survival. But was the gal the true target of the attack, or did she become a random victim of a madman? An unknown car stopped near the pub entrance, and minutes later, the shooting started. In addition to the deceased, 4 other men received gunshot wounds of varying severity, all of them young people aged 22 to 33 who spent in the evening in the establishment and lived in the nearby towns. Initially, the police were inclined to believe that the murdered woman was a random victim. It was known that criminal gangs were operating in the area periodically. The shooting was likely to routine showdown between their members. However, all of this was just conjecture, which would have to be proven or disproved in the course of the investigation. So the detectives delved deeper into the victim's personality, like the witnesses to the crime. The victim's relatives were at a loss as to who could have wanted Elle's death, as the girl seemed to have no ill wishes or enemies capable of such horrors. The detectives decided to interview other witnesses and the victims of the unknown criminal's gunfire. In addition, law enforcement officers requested the pub owner's video surveillance recordings. It would be necessary to talk to dozens of people and analyze several hours of video recordings. Several police officers were working on the extensive investigation. It was necessary to answer several difficult questions. There were too many victims of the attack, but was this spontaneous aggression, or did the perpetrator pursue a specific target? All witnesses to the incident were interrogated. However, checking mobile communications data took more time. The media were notified to assist in the investigation. Law enforcement officers urged anyone with valuable information to come to the police station. First and foremost, this concerned possible video recordings made by random eyewitnesses on any of which the car in which the aggressor arrived might appear. After the crime, the police held a meeting with local residents. The purpose of this communication was to persuade people possessing valuable information to share it with law enforcement officers. It was assumed that someone might have seen the moment of the attack or know the criminal. People were urged not to be afraid of the criminals and the local feuding clans. Community leaders supported local residents during this difficult time. In addition to the conversations, activists went door to door and communicated with the neighbors. Special trained officers worked with the family of the deceased, their goal being to provide them with support in connection with the heavy loss. In the course of this work, it was established that the perpetrator had left the pub parking lot in a dark-colored car. Eyewitness accounts regarding it may differed. It was dark and it was difficult to make out anything, but the most likely was a dark Mercedes A-Class. Later, this was confirmed after checking the outdoor surveillance cameras. The killer did not immediately open fire, but drove up to the parking lot and observed the pub visitors for some time. He sat in the car so that he could freely see the entrance and most of what was happening inside. Apparently, he was choosing the most convenient moment for the attack. After a few minutes of surveillance, when Al came out, the criminal quickly got out of the car, fired 12 shots, then instantly got back behind the wheel and disappeared. Investigators, after studying the recordings, made an important conclusion. The attacker was a liar. No one helped him. It was not possible to trace the exact location where the perpetrator fled. Therefore, the detectives went door to all local residents, describing the car and recounting the circumstances of the incident, trying to establish the identity of the killer. Patrolling the streets was carried out around the clock, and this yielded results. Just 2 days after the shooting, detectives detained 2 suspects, but no names were mentioned until all the circumstances were clarified. However, it was not possible to prove their involvement in the crime, in particular because the murder weapon was not found. After that, the detectives made a statement to the public saying that they would not rest until the unknown shooter was punished. All this was intended to calm the local residents who were outraged by the rampant crime and the powerlessness of the authorities. It was also assumed that the attack had been provoked by a feud between local gangs. In this case, L would be considered a random victim. However, all this was also just an assumption that remained to be verified. In the course of the investigation, it was possible to establish that the potential targets could have been Jake Duct and Kiram Seld, members of the local Beechwood gang, who was spending the evening in the pub. It became known that they had been in long-term fierce conflict with another group claiming this territory. On December 29th, police arrested another person, but he was not the one who opened fire. The suspect had a solid alibi that excluded him from the list of suspects. However, the detective suspected that he had participated in the setup for the attack. Around the same time, the dark Mercedes car in which the killer had left the pub parking lot was identified. But due to the lack of direct evidence, the name of the third suspect was also not disclosed. There were some difficulties with the found car. The car was traced through video surveillance systems and identified thanks to the cameras, but law enforcement officers were too late. On December 31st, the police department received the report that the fire had started near the scene of the shooting. When the special services arrived at the scene, they found a dark Mercedes similar to the perpetrator's vehicle, which was engulfed in flames. The vehicle was completely burned out. Valuable evidence was lost in the flames. The perpetrators clearly knew that the police were on their trail, so they decided to destroy one of the direct pieces of evidence. Despite the fact that the fire did not completely destroy the car, it was confirmed that it had been used during the shooting. However, the Mercedes did not belong to the perpetrators, but had been stolen shortly before the attack. Presumably, the arson was committed intentionally to complicate the investigation after the murder of competitors. On January 11th, 2 more suspects, a 22-year-old man and a 23-year-old woman, were delivered to the police department. They were arrested in Central Wales. The man's name was Connor Chapman. He was well known to the police. He had an extensive criminal record that he had accumulated over the past 5 years before the murder of L. Edwards. Connor had started with daring law breakings and gradually sank deeper into the abyss of crime. One of his first serious crimes was a car theft under aggravating circumstances. He had repeatedly become a suspect in robberies, hooliganism, and threatening behavior. Once the young man was involved in a chase with the police, after which he abandoned the car and hid in the bushes nearby. When they detained him, the criminal said that he did not understand what chase they were talking about and that he was here just waiting for a friend. In this case, he became the real star. The detainee's data ended up in newspaper headlines. Carla Chapman was from Birkenhead, Liverpool. His parents had left him at an early age, so his grandparents had formalized guardianship. It was in their house that the hero of the story moved. The teenager dropped out of high school shortly before the exams. In general, he studied poorly, and no special hopes were pinned on him. He was always considered a problem child. The young hooligan first became a defendant in a court case in 2014 when he was 14 years old. Connor was accused of shoplifting. As early as 2016, he committed another crime. His involvement in the theft of a car was proven when the young man was detained in a stolen vehicle. He did not have a driver's license or insurance, which was a violation of the terms of his suspended sentence. In 2017, high theft was added to the storage of prohibited substances. During this period, he was also under police supervision, so he had again violated the restraining order. As a result, he was banned from accessing several parts of the city. Connor was not allowed to appear in public places as he clearly posed a threat to society. However, as early as 2019, he violated the ban again. The patrols detained him in a public place. The young man had a knife and prohibited substances with him. In the same year, the general public first heard about Connor Chapman. He appeared on the pages of the local newspaper after an unsuccessful attempt to escape from the police in a stolen car. The city patrol noticed a stolen Audi on the street and ordered the driver to stop and get out of the car with his hands up. However, the 18-year-old Chapman did not obey, provoking a chase. During the short flight, Connor committed a large number of traffic violations. In particular, he accelerated to more than 80 kilometers per hour in areas with a 30-kilometer limit. Tanner repeatedly drove into oncoming traffic and in the end crashed into the curb. At B, the car was thrown aside and turned around. The driver could not continue the orgy, so he got out of the car and ran away. However, even here, he was unlucky as the patrol caught up with him in the bushes just a few 100 meters away. In his defense, the young man said that he was waiting here for a friend, but the deception was obvious. The lawyer of Connor explained in court that his client had fallen under the influence of a bad company of old affairs. The court left him unpunished and the need to release the budding criminal. He was found to have attention deficit disorder and a number of other disorders identified by private specials during the trial. Despite this, due to numerous violations and potentially dangerous behavior on the road, he was sentenced to a term of up to 8 months in prison for 2 manners. The young man also received a ban on driving a car, which was in effect after his release. Thus, the budding criminal had achieved 14 convictions for 30 criminal episodes by the time he reached adulthood. It was obvious that he had no intention of changing and categorically refused to fit into society. Everyone understood that he was potentially dangerous, but legal grounds for isolating him from society had not been found. This was due to the fact that so far no person had been seriously injured by his inadequate behavior. The public was outraged by the powerlessness of the authorities. Everything was shaping up so that the criminal elements could do nothing until they kill or maim innocent people, and that's how it turned out. In January 2020, the court again sentenced Connor Chapman, this time to 10 months in prison. He was again caught in a public place with a cold weapon and substances in his pocket, a whole bouquet of prohibitive lists. During this period, the police openly appeared on TV channels, urging the public to beware of this young man. After serving his sentence protected months, he again got involved in crime and was wanted for at least 5 criminal episodes. When he was caught, the young criminal said that he had spent more time behind bars than free, and he did not seem upset about this, but rather proud of his achievements. However, Connor had no intention of stopping there. By the age of 20, his service record had expanded again. By this point, he had received 19 sentences for 43 crimes. But in the summer of 2022, the inadequate young man found himself free again. This happened just 6 months before the death of L. Edwardser. During this period, Connor was again brought before the court. His lawyer tried to play on pity, telling the story that the first child of the young man was born while he was in prison. At this point, his girlfriend was pregnant with a girl. The young man claimed that he had rethought his life and wanted to get on the path of correction. Of course, these were loud, false words. The only thing he wanted was to get free and return to the path of crime. During this period, the police already knew that he was a member of one of the local criminal gangs engaged in the sale of prohibited substances. However, the criminal was tried not for these serious crimes, but for burglary and theft of 2 electric motorcycles. On December 24, 322, a skirmish broke out between 2 rival criminal gangs. They began to argue over the division of the territory near the wooden church in Beechwood Estates. They failed to reach an agreement, after which the young gangster decided to take revenge. He armed himself with a submachine gun and waited for about 3 hours until he tracked down his targets. He wanted to kill Curran Seld and Jake Duffy, who had gone to the Moyak pub for rest. Shortly before midnight, the criminal drove up to the parking lot and began to observe. He identified his victims and waited for the right moment to attack, then ran out of a car and fired 12 bullets into the building. He managed to seriously injure Duffy, but despite the threat to his life, he survived the attack. However, the unlucky Elle Edwitzer was not so fortunate. 2 bullets hit her in the head. The young beauty fought for her life, but died in the arms of the medics on the way to the hospital. The girl accidentally met the killer's targets that evening and did not even suspect tragically. The pub was crowded. Then 1 person was killed and 4 were wounded. One 22-year-old man was shot in the leg, a 24-year-old young man was wounded in the arm, and a 33-year-old man in the wrist. None of these injuries were life-threatening. Elle's friends tried to provide her with assistance and perform artificial respiration right on the spot. However, this was not enough to save her life. Elle's sister, Lucy, was much liked here. She lived in Dubai and flew home to celebrate Christmas with her family. Just minutes before the attack, she had left the establishment, so she was not affected at all. Later, Lucy recalled how she had wanted to take her sister with her, but the girl wanted to stay with her friends. On January 25, 2023, the funeral of the young girl took place. 100 of concerned people came to say goodbye to the random victim of gang showdowns. The body was brought to the local church in a hearse drawn by 4 white horses. Even the pub that had become the site of the girl's last celebration was closed that day as a mark of respect for her memory. The owner of the establishment published a message of support for Hell's family on his official social media page. Connor Chapman was charged with a whole list of charges, the main one of which was murder. It became known that the Perth Troda had an accomplice, namely the 20-year-old Thomas. After the arrest and during the searches, a video recording was found on this young man, which had been made shortly before the attack. In it, Connor is handing over a weapon and saying that he is going to settle accounts with someone. After the attack, they together hid the stolen Mercedes in order to get rid of it later. The murder weapon was never found. However, the killer's DNA traces were found on one of the shell casings fired. It was obvious that it was Connor who loaded the weapon before the attack. In addition, red gloves were found during searches in his house, which were clearly visible in the CCTV footage from morning. After the crime, when the perpetrators had abandoned the car, they ordered a taxi under a false name. They used the driver's services to cover their tracks and confused the investigation. Around 5 a.m., they returned to the place where the hidden car was located. Here, the criminals tried to cover their tracks. However, something went wrong. Ultimately, they decided to get rid of the car by setting it on fire. Thomas Nord was found guilty on all charges brought against him. In July 2023, the court sentenced him to 9 years in prison. This modest sentence was due to the fact that he had not yet managed to accumulate such a wide criminal history as his accomplice. Jake and Karen were wounded in the moment of the attack, but both managed to survive the assault. A look at their lifestyle made the aggression of one of the members of the rival gangs quite understandable. Both were members of the local Beechwood gang, which was openly in conflict with another group claiming this territory. It became known that on December 23, 2023, just a day before the attack with firearms, they had already been attacked. On that occasion, another person from Connor Chapman's group had assaulted them. Both were beaten, but did not receive serious injuries. Apparently, they considered this a random fight and calmly went to relax in the pub. While the shooter awaited his sentence in the case of the murder of the innocent victim, both targets of his attack were already in prison. Curran was sentenced to 27 months in prison for an attack on members of the rival criminal group. Another 9 months were added to the sentence for the fight. His friend was sentenced to 2 years 9 months for a similar offense. Obviously, they were trying to avenge the attempted murder. Prohibitive court orders were also issued against both of them with a whole list of restrictions. Of course, this method did not allow protecting citizens from this gang of criminals. However, in case of further violations, more severe punishment could be applied to them due to ignoring the prescriptions. The public was outraged that potentially dangerous members of criminal gangs were getting away with minimum sentences after each crime. The bans were clearly and did not contribute absolutely anything to public safety. This became especially obvious when it was found that Chapman already had a ban on visiting that region where the pub was located. But this did not prevent him from stealing a car and coming to the public place despite the fact that he also had a driving ban. The events that had occurred once again raised the question of toughening punishments and revising the existing norms of the legal system. However, so far, this flawed system has not suffered any serious changes. At the trial on the case of Elle's murder, Connor tried to refute that it was he who appeared on the CCTV footage. According to him, during this period, he was at home packing Christmas gifts. However, a sufficient amount of evidence was collected to expose the lie. The hearings on the case lasted 3.5 weeks, during which all the circumstances preceding the attack were revealed. It became known that the reason for the attack was only the competition between the two criminal gangs dividing the territory nearby. The defendant did not even know the victim. He simply did not care about her fate, as well as the fate of all the other innocent people in the bar. He was driven only by blind fury, which he could never control. After the attempted murder of two competitors, Connor planned to flee to Spain to cover his tracks. He used a stolen car and also got rid of the murder weapon. Trying not to fall into the hands of the police, he avoided using any mode of transport. The detectives detained the criminal literally at the airport. After the arrest, Connor tried to deceive the police, planning that the Mercedes he was seen driving on the day of the murder was not stolen. According to him, this was a common car of the criminal group, which they used for the distribution of substances. The guy claimed that he was not behind the wheel of the vehicle, and also continued to convince the jury that he did not open fire that evening. He was desperately trying to get out of the situation. The defendant stated that he had only just learned that someone from the criminal group had used the vehicle for an attack on the pub. Before the jury retired to consider the verdict, the father of the innocent victim made a short speech. He sincerely hoped that the criminal would never again be able to spend Christmas with his loved ones in freedom. The jurors, consisting of Preeti Ushin and son Jen Shin, came to a unanimous decision after 3 hours of discussion. In their opinion, Connor Chapman was guilty of all the charges brought against him. He cynically committed the crime and did not repent of the fact that he accidentally killed the beautiful 26-year-old girl. The whole life that lay ahead of her, and he took it away. Instead of remorse, the heartless Connor spent several days carefully getting rid of all the evidence and traces of the murder that could link him to this bloody event. The motive for the attack was the competition between criminal games. On July 7, 2023, Connor was sentenced. He was sent to serve a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 48 years from the start of serving the sentence. After the verdict was announced, the victim's father victoriously raised his fist. The incident provoked a wave of public outrage. The residents of the city could not feel safe, knowing that they were at the junction of the confrontation between criminal gangs dividing spheres of influence. They knew that these people had a large amount of firearms and were not afraid to use them, as proved by the murder of Elle. The girl's father said he wanted to set up a foundation to support victims like his daughter. He believed that the main goal would be to fight to reduce the number of weapons in the hands of civilians. Wednesdays were always a whirlwind at the offices of The Spectator, a weekly newspaper in Joliet, Illinois, which needed its latest edition finalized by Wednesday night for printing early Thursday. On Wednesday, September 25, 1957, Molly Zelko began her day at the office at 7 a.m., eventually working an exhausting 17-hour shift, just slightly longer than her typical day. Molly's role at The Spectator was multifaceted. She had started 21 years earlier as the paper's secretary-treasurer, primarily managing its business operations. Over the years, however, her responsibilities expanded significantly. Molly became deeply involved in content creation, frequently investigating and writing stories. Every aspect of the paper required her approval, and she was known for demanding perfection in every proof she reviewed. After a day filled with phone calls on her private line and meticulous edits to the paper's layout, Molly left the office at 11:27 p.m. By then, Nearly all of that week's edition had been completed, save for the front page, which she planned to finalize first thing the next morning when she returned at 6 a.m. But Molly would never make it back to the Spectator. Instead, she would become the subject of its next front page headline. At 5:15 a.m. on Thursday, September 26th, two printers arrived at the Spectator and called Molly to wake her, as was their routine. There was no answer. When she failed to arrive by 6 a.m. as expected, they grew concerned and drove to her home on Buell Avenue, just 3 minutes away. When they arrived, Molly's black 1955 Chrysler was parked in front of the apartment. Her car keys were under the seat where she typically left them. One of the shoes Molly had been wearing the night before was on the trunk of the car, and the other was found in the grass nearby. The printers called other staff members and two of Molly's siblings. The group got locksmith to come out and let them into Molly's apartment on the second floor. There was no sign of Molly inside. It did not appear that her bed had been slept in the night before, and the jewelry she had been wearing the previous day was not found inside the apartment. The police were called. The investigation quickly turned up a few clues. Neighbors reported hearing muffled screams, as well as the sound of a car speeding down the street sometime around midnight. They all had attributed the noises to rambunctious teenagers. The shoe had been on the trunk of the car because a man walking down the street at 12:15 a.m. had seen it on the ground and picked it up and placed it there so that its owner would find it. Based on the times of these two accounts, ever happened to Molly had happened very quickly. Molly had previously told friends and family members that if anyone ever came after her, she would take off her shoes and try to run, leaving the shoes behind as a sign that something had happened to her. While it seems unlikely that Molly would have had time to take off her shoes while trying to flee and attack her, Molly did habitually drive without her shoes on. If she had been attacked as soon as she got out of her car, she would not have had her shoes on and could have thrown them on the ground to leave as a clue. Molly's disappearance became a major news story in part because her co-workers at the newspaper made it so. Reporters from across the Midwest traveled to Joliet to cover the case as well. The air and ground search for Molly spanned 5 counties. Local motorcycle riders and hot rod drivers searched the back roads of Joliet. Waterways were also searched. Despite the media coverage and the thorough searches, Molly Zilko remained missing. Molly had been born on May 9, 1910 in Joliet. Both of her parents were Slovenian immigrants, and when her father Frank became a United States citizen a year before her birth, he had altered the spelling of the family surname to make it seem less foreign to native-born Americans as many immigrants did at the time. Molly's first name was Americanized as well. Her legal name as it appears on her birth certificate was Amalia. She would, as an adult, sign her name to official documents like her will and passport as it appeared on her birth certificate, but she publicly used the more common name Amelia. However, her full first name really mattered as most people called Amelia by her preferred nickname, Molly. At the age of 17, Molly had gotten a job as a secretary at the law practice of William McCabe. McCabe would be a fixture in Molly's professional career, and she will remain fiercely loyal to him. The 42-year-old was a lawyer by the time he hired Molly, but he had started out his career as a reporter in 1903 and had worked for several newspapers. McCabe was also heavily involved in politics. He had served 6 terms as an Illinois state representative and then as the mayor of Lockport, Illinois for 2 years. In 1932, he was elected Will County State's attorney and made Molly his office manager. In June of 1936, McCabe decided to get back into the newspaper business after he lost his bid for re-election as state's attorney. He bought The Spectator, a weekly newspaper in Joliet. That December, he made a deal with Molly. He offered her the position of secretary-treasurer of The Spectator, a position which would pay her $20 a week. Her main responsibility would be to ensure the paper's finances were built on a solid foundation. If she achieved this goal, she would be given 33 shares of Spectator stock. Molly received these shares at the beginning of 1945. On April 7, 1948, William McCabe, who was again running for public office, was beaten with baseball bats and left for dead along a rural road by 4 attackers. He was not found for several hours. While he survived the attack, he was plagued by pain and health problems for the remainder of his life. This left him unable to be as active in the day-to-day operations of The Spectator. With McCabe out of the office much more frequently due to his injuries, Molly took on more and more of the responsibilities of the newspaper. While Molly had been a major part of The Spectator, it was at this point that she became the main driving force behind it. Molly received 15 more shares of stock in the paper in December of 1951. In 1953, she and William McCabe established a trust agreement. They each held 48 shares of stock in The Spectator and gave 3 additional shares to State's Attorney Frank Masters to hold in trust. In the event that either Molly or William passed away, Masters was to sign the 3 shares over to the surviving member of the agreement, which would give them controlling interest in the paper. Given William McCabe's advanced age and poor health, he was expected to pass away long before Molly, making the trust agreement essentially his way of making Molly Zilko his heir apparent as far as The Spectator was concerned. The attack on McCabe resulted in Molly being much more involved at the paper, and it also resulted in Molly getting involved in investigations that made a lot of dangerous people unhappy. Molly believed that her longtime employer and business partner had been attacked by members of a local crime syndicate. Joliet was plagued at the time by political corruption and organized crime. Just before McCabe was attacked, The Spectator had run several articles about the illegal gambling operations the syndicate operated in the area. Molly believed that McCabe had been targeted because of the attention he had brought to the illicit operation and not for political motives. Molly would use The Spectator to voice her opposition to corruption and organized crime right up until her disappearance. She publicly denounced the minor punishment Joliet's mayor received for failing to pay taxes on kickbacks he had received. She figured out how to record phone calls and had several contractors fixing bids on city projects on tape. She banned the wife of suspected gang leader Francis the Thin Man Curry from the paper society pages and would copy down license plate numbers from cars parked outside the Curry home while they were having parties. She reported heavily on local illegal gambling activities and the failure of police to shut them down. Gambling and its ties to organized crime dominated much of Molly's work at The Spectator just prior to her disappearance. Francis Curry's organization controlled the distribution and operation of pinball machines in Joliet. A Supreme Court ruling had also just declared that pinball machines were to be considered gambling devices. Molly, therefore, wrote editorials supporting city council candidates who wanted to ban the machines in Joliet, as well as the legislation itself. The city council voted to ban pinball machines in August of 1957, with the ordinance going into effect the following January. That same month, Molly focused in on an illegal gambling establishment operating out of an area warehouse, sending reporters and a photographer to investigate it. The attention resulted in the establishment having to close down. It reopened 2 weeks after Molly went missing. In short, there was not a shortage of dangerous people who would have been happy to see Molly Zilko disappear. While Molly publicly showed no fear in her writing, refusing to back down in her coverage of corruption and crime, she did often fear for her safety. She frequently suspected that she was being followed and once called one of her brothers because she thought someone was waiting to attack her in the parking lot outside of the Spectator offices. He drove over and sat in his car in the parking lot with a shotgun to watch her as she walked to her car in case she had been right. Molly's office window had also previously been shot at. However, a mob-related abduction or politically driven crime is not the only possible scenario in Molly's case. It has been considered that Molly may have voluntarily disappeared and left her shoes outside her apartment to make it appear as though she had been abducted. Molly normally had the press room foreman follow her on the short drive home when she left work late at night. On the night she went missing, she did not ask him to, which further added to the speculation that she left on her own accord. Given the concern she had about her safety, it would not have been unreasonable for her to leave town and start a new life as her own personal version of the witness protection program. After Molly's disappearance began receiving publicity, numerous possible sightings of her were reported around the country. By the summer of 1958, FBI offices in a dozen cities across the country had followed up on alleged sightings of Molly. None of these sightings were ever substantiated. Molly was also allegedly spotted overseas, but her passport had expired in 1953, and she had never applied for a new one. It was also suggested after Molly disappeared that she had less than honorable reasons for wanting to leave Joliet. Molly did own several luxury items, like mink coats and expensive jewelry that seemed too expensive for someone with Molly's salary to purchase. When she went missing, she was wearing a diamond ring and a bracelet that was worth $5,000. She also owned a 17.5-carat diamond ring that had reportedly been exhibited at the 1933 World's Fair and was valued at more than $30,000. This led to rumors that Molly had been embezzling money from the Spectator and had run off to live on the stolen money she had hidden in a secret bank account. However, when William McCabe's daughters, who did not like Molly or the amount of influence she had at the Spectator, took over operations at the paper in Molly's absence, their first order of business was to order an audit of the paper's finances, which showed no missing funds or discrepancies. At least some of Molly's expensive jewelry had reasonable explanations. The diamond ring Molly had been wearing the night she disappeared is rumored to be the engagement ring she had been given as a young woman. Her fiancé had been killed in an accident, and Molly never married anyone else. Molly had also only paid $5,000 for the 17.5-carat ring because she had purchased it from an estate. Molly also only paid $55 a month in rent for her second-floor apartment. She barely furnished it since she spent so much time at work. This would leave a larger portion of her salary available for discretionary spending. While all of the money she had to spend on expensive items isn't necessarily accounted for, there is no evidence of gross financial misconduct on her part. With local authorities having no luck in finding Molly, her friends and family began putting pressure on the FBI to get involved. One Molly's brothers organized a petition which received more than 5,000 signatures, imploring the FBI to take up the case. William McCabe wrote J. Edgar Hoover personally, arguing that the FBI's involvement was necessary because of the corruption going on in Joliet and Molly's advocacy against it. Publicly, the FBI refused to take on the case, claiming that there was no actual proof that Molly had been abducted or that any other federal law had been broken, which would have been necessary for them to have authority to investigate the case. Covertly, however, the FBI did in fact show an interest in Molly's case. They pulled tax returns for Molly and her associates, checked for secret accounts in dozens of banks, and followed up on and discredited several reported sightings of Molly. By January of 1958, with no more leads and no evidence that any federal statutes have been violated, the agent in charge of the FBI's office in Chicago wrote to J. Edgar Hoover asking for permission to end the Bureau's investigation. Hoover insisted that the case remain open and would deny all further requests to shut down the investigation for more than a year and a half. Hoover was skeptical of the authorities in Joliet, of the local crime syndicate of the Zelko family, and of Molly herself. While Hoover believed there were a lot of leads for the Bureau to investigate, none of them located Molly or proved that a federal crime had been committed. Molly's disappearance also caught the attention of future presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy. In 1958, Kennedy was the chief counsel for the Senate Rackets Committee and came across Molly's case while investigating organized crime's involvement in the coin machine industry. Kennedy came to Illinois to interview James Rennie, a mob enforcer serving time in prison for, among other things, threatening a newspaper editor who had been reporting on criminal ties to pinball machines. During his meeting with Kennedy, Rennie confessed to being involved in Molly Zilko's kidnapping and claimed to know where she had been buried. Kennedy and his investigator went to the farm Rennie had identified as the site of the burial and dug for Molly's remains themselves, but found nothing. Rennie later admitted to fabricating the story in hopes that Kennedy could get his sentence reduced. In 1978, reporters Lonnie Kane and John Whiteside published a series of articles re-examining Molly's case. In the course of their investigation, they uncovered two new major witnesses in the case. One of them was a bartender who may in fact have been the last person to see Molly before she disappeared. According to the bartender, Molly had come into the private club where he worked and had a drink on the night she vanished. She left him a 50-cent tip and asked for $4 and change. She then made at least 2 long-distance phone calls from a phone booth and left. The phone records from that day had long been destroyed by the time Keene and Whiteside heard about this account, so there was no way for them to confirm it or investigate the people Molly had called. The bartender's story does fill in a gap on the timeline of Molly's final night. Her apartment was just a 3-minute drive from her office at The Spectator. Molly left the office at 11:27, and Molly's neighbors heard screams around midnight. If those screams came from Molly as she was being abducted, and she was abducted as she got out of her car to go into her apartment, then there is almost a half hour of time that would be unaccounted for, during which she could have stopped at the club for a drink. The second witness was a woman who insisted that she remain anonymous and was given the pseudonym Sarah in Kane and Whiteside's coverage of her account. In September of 1957, Sarah lived on Stryker Avenue in Joliet across the street from a construction site where a storm sewer pipe was being put in. At 1:30 a.m. on September 26th, an hour and a half after Molly Zilko's suspected abduction, she awoke to the sound of a car and got up to see if it was her husband arriving home. It was not. Sarah claimed to have seen 4 men get out of a dark car with Michigan license plates. They took something long and wrapped in a blanket out of the trunk of the car. Sarah then saw a woman's limp leg fall out of the blanket. The men buried the woman in the ditch that had been dug for the pipe before driving off. At least one of these men worked at the construction site, and Sarah saw him bulldozing over the area the following morning. This man was one of many who worked at the site who would come over to Sarah's house to ask water. When this man came to ask for water that day, he asked Sarah if she had slept well the night before, and she feared that he had seen her witness the burial from her window. Sarah agreed to be hypnotized under the supervision of a doctor. The doctor believed that she was being truthful and that she had experienced a traumatic event the night Molly Zilko went missing. Kane and Whiteside were also able to confirm that there had been a storm sewer pipe construction project on Stryker Avenue in September 1957. The Will County State's attorney did not find Sarah's statements convincing. Sarah had waited 21 years to come forward and was not an ideal witness. Since Kane and Whiteside cannot reveal her identity, they cannot provide exact details as to why, but they have described her as having personal problems and strange beliefs. An exhumation of the area would have been very difficult and expensive, and as such was never carried out since it would have been done solely based on Sarah's account. John Whiteside passed away from cancer in 2005 at the age of 61. Lonnie Kane maintains a Facebook page dedicated to Molly's case and is currently working on both a book and an 8-part podcast about her story. Molly's longtime mentor and business partner, William McCabe, died less than a year after she went missing. In 1959, Molly's shares of The Spectator were sold to McCabe's widow, Ada, for $51,000. The paper's popularity and success began to diminish, and the McCabe family sold it 4 years later. The Spectator went out of business in 1965. Molly Zilko was legally declared dead in 1964. From the outside, the England family appeared to embody perfection. Every Sunday, they attended church as a united family, showcasing exemplary devotion. However, few could imagine the secrets concealed behind the closed doors of this seemingly respectable household. The story of William and Sandra began in 1983 when they met at church. William was 18 and Sandra was 16. With their parents' blessings, the young couple soon married and settled in the small town of Logan, Ohio. Bill Inman, as William was known, considered himself deeply religious. He worked as a builder and dedicated his free time to serving at the Evangelical Church of the Tabernacle of Faith near Nelson Villa. Bill played musical instruments during services, while Sandra, a housewife, supported his spiritual endeavors. In 1984, they welcomed their first child, a son named William Jr. To avoid confusion within the church community, the father was called Bill, and the son became known as Will. Over the years, Will grew up surrounded by his parents' strong faith. In 2001, at the age of 17, Will met 15-year-old Summer Cook during a church service. Their meeting echoed the love story of Bill and Sandra. After dating for 3 years, the young couple married in 2004 when Summer turned 18. They moved in with Will's parents in their spacious Logan home. That same year, 39-year-old Bill declared himself a spiritual leader. He converted his garage into a makeshift church and began holding services. Despite initial skepticism from local residents, Bill's home church gradually gained followers. Neighbors and their acquaintances began attending, seeking prayer, solace, and spiritual guidance, along with leaving donations to support the ministry. In 2005, Will and Summer became happy parents of a boy named Alex. However, along with the joys of parenthood, the young couple faced financial difficulties. Bill's church activities did not bring in substantial income, so the family decided to try their luck in another state. In search of a better life, the Inlands moved to Florida in 2006. In their new location, Bill and Will quickly found work in the construction industry building hotels. Meanwhile, Sandra and Summer took care of the home and raised little Alex. However, after just 2 years longing for their hometown, the family returned to Ohio. Unfortunately, during their absence, they had lost the right to buy back their previous house in Logan. They had to rent another place in the rural area of Vinton. Almost immediately after returning, in 2008, Will and Summer became parents again this time. They had a daughter named Kaylee. 2 years later, the couple's third child, a girl named Alana, was born. Despite the challenges of raising young children, the young parents tried to set aside time for themselves. Almost every weekend, they left the kids under the care of Bill and Sandra, who gladly took on the roles of grandmother and grandfather. For the elderly couple, their grandchildren became the true meaning of life. In the spring of 2010, Bill Inman officially became a pastor, heading the Church of the Tabernacle of Faith. Together with his wife, he also founded a charitable organization called Ranch of Mercy, aiming to help the underprivileged, those who had lost their jobs or homes. Bill dreamed of building a large shelter for orphans and widows with his own hands. However, there was a lack of funds to realize this plan. That's when Bill came up with the idea of holding a lottery. By selling tickets for $10 each, he hoped to raise the necessary amount. The lucky winner would receive a new house or $200,000 additionally. Bill promised to raffle off 99 other valuable prizes. Information about the lottery was disseminated through local media and advertising. Bill personally went door to door, urging people to join the good cause and purchase tickets. He assured that the proceeds would go towards building a shelter for the needy. In total, Inman managed to sell 100,000 tickets and raise $1 million. The prize draw was scheduled for September 2010. While Bill was engaged in charity work, problems were brewing in the Inman's personal life. In June 2010, Summer confessed to her husband that she wanted a divorce after 6 years of marriage. Shortly before this, she made a bitter entry in her diary. "I'm so tired of pleasing everyone. So exhausted. Don't I deserve happiness? Don't I have the right to fall in love again and feel loved in return? Maybe it's not the best time, but I have to tell Will the truth. He needs to know that I don't want to be with him anymore. I need to be alone. Figure myself out. Understand who I really am, because right now, I'm just a slave who follows orders. I love my children endlessly and wouldn't trade them for anything, but I don't want them to see their mother simply obeying someone else's will. I don't know how Will is going to react to this. Maybe he'll get furious, try to take the kids and run away, or start threatening, hurting me. I think we should have equal time with the children. I know his parents will be against it and will try to convince me to stay, and I understand that it won't change anything. Yesterday, Will asked me what I want, and I couldn't answer because I only know what I don't want to be unhappy, to feel trapped. But I remain silent. Every day, all I can do is cry and sleep. Nothing more. I just don't know how to get out of this situation and make everything all right. I hope that the next time I write here, I'll have found the answer." Summer filed for divorce and moved out of the Inman's house with the children and essential belongings to her parents' home. She didn't want to deprive Alex, Kaylee, and Alana of communication with their father, so she allowed them to see Will and his parents. 2 months after leaving her husband, Summer started a romance with Adam Peters. At the same time, she got a job as a cleaner at a bank located in the center of Logan. The woman had no education, so she couldn't find other work. Meanwhile, September-October passed, but the house lottery promised by Bill from Ranch of Mercy never took place. Moreover, it turned out that the construction of the prize house hadn't even begun. The organization was in no hurry to return people's money for the tickets. In early December 2010, the Inmans were informed about the need to vacate their rented housing due to debt. Upon learning this, Summer came with Adam to pick up the belongings that were left there. However, Will and his parents didn't let their former daughter-in-law in. Summer called the police and complained that her husband, whom she was divorcing, was threatening her and wouldn't give back her personal belongings. When law enforcement arrived, Will continued to refuse to let anyone into the house, threatened to shoot Adam, and even got into a fight with a police officer. In her statement, Sommer said that before the wedding, she and Will had an ideal relationship. But after getting married, he changed abruptly, started controlling her every step, being jealous, and making groundless accusations. He dictated to his wife what to do and when, interfering in the most intimate areas of life, eating habits, household chores, even sexual relations. Sumner couldn't even get enough sleep without her husband's permission. He effectively kept her under house arrest, forbidding her to leave the home. He hid her mobile phone and keys. The woman admitted that Will dreamed of having 12 children with her and even planned to take a second wife. He could often be seen on websites for polygamous families where he posted his explicit photos. Will threatened to kill Summer if she dared to leave him. Once, he even took her beloved cats, drove them somewhere, and then lied that they had escaped through an open window. He laughed, saying she would never see them again. After his wife's accusations, Will tried to justify himself. He claimed he took away her phone and keys because he suspected her of cheating. As for the cats, he simply took them to a shelter because they were scratching the furniture and attacking family members. Will was prohibited from approaching Summer and was sentenced to a fine and probation. At the same time, a custody battle erupted between the two families. The Inmans filed a police report accusing Adam Peters of being dangerous to Alex, Kaylee, and Alana. A terrifying event occurred late in the evening of March 22, 2011. 25-year-old Summer was finishing her shift at the bank. As usual, she cleaned up the workspaces and went outside around 11 p.m. to take out the trash. Before that, Summer had sent a message to Adam, whom she was supposed to meet after work, but he never saw his beloved again. Worried, Adam went to the bank after midnight. He didn't find Summer, but near the dumpster, he saw her belongings, her phone, keys, a running player with headphones. A little further in the bushes lay her jacket. Adam called the police and informed Summer's parents about her disappearance. At first, the family thought the woman might have been delayed at work or lost her personal items, but the bank's security service assured them they hadn't seen her after the end of her shift. When law enforcement arrived at the scene, several witnesses were already waiting. Two women who were out for a jog at the time said they had witnessed Summer being abducted by unknown individuals an hour earlier. According to them, when the woman approached the dumpster, a white Ford Crown Victoria driven by a blonde pulled up. Two men in black balaclavas jumped out of the car, grabbed Summer, and forcibly pushed her into the back seat. The victim resisted, screamed, and begged for help. One of the witnesses tried to intervene, but the female driver sprayed pepper spray in his face. After that, the kidnappers fled with Summer. The women immediately ran to the nearest police station and reported what they had seen. However, for some reason, law enforcement tweeted their statement with skepticism, even suspicion. They decided that the witnesses had made up this story for fun. A whole hour passed after Summer's parents contacted the police before they finally arrived at the crime scene. Unfortunately, it was too late. The missing woman could not be found while the trail was still hot. News of the abduction of 25-year-old Summer Inman instantly spread through the local media. Hundreds of concerned residents of Logan rallied to help with the search. But days passed, and hope of finding the woman alive faded. The parents of the missing tried not to think about the worst. A few weeks before the tragedy, Summer had posted a photo on Facebook with Adam and the children. In it, they looked like a happy family. Seeing this photo on Adam's page, Will Inman became genuinely enraged. There had long been a quiet confrontation between these two men. It turned out that Summer had met Adam even before deciding to divorce her husband. In the spring of 2010, Peters got a job working for the Inmans, taking care of their house and yard. That's where he fell for Summer. Initially, the woman rejected Adam's advances, but eventually gave in. In her diary, there was an entry. When our eyes met, I realized that the devil had taken hold of me. I didn't listen to the voice of God. I tried to stop myself. My mind screamed, "Run. Get out of here now." But I stayed and allowed Adam to embrace me and then delve deeper. I regret it. I am guilty. Meeting Adam was the beginning of the end for Summer and Will's marriage. The woman realized that she wanted to be happy, to love and be loved, so she filed for divorce. 5 days before Summer's disappearance, Will tried to challenge the amount of alimony in court. He didn't want to pay his ex-wife $150 per child every month and asked to reduce the amount to $50. After all, at that time, his annual income was only $6,500 a month. Will, along with his parents, fought for sole custody of the children, but the judge rejected their demands. Bill and Sandra missed their grandchildren very much as they were the meaning of their lives. After parting with Summer, the elderly couple had noticeably lost weight and become haggard. In March 2011, shortly after Summer's disappearance, the police found the Inman family. Bill, Sandra, and Will were hiding in the home of Bill's mother, a 70-year-old woman from Jackson County, Ohio. During the interrogation, all three unanimously assured that they were not involved in Summer's abduction. They claimed that on the night in question, they had gone to Cleveland to look at a new house. On the way, the car broke down, and they had to spend the whole night repairing it on the side of the road. They only returned home to Logan in the morning. The Inman said that they had always treated Summer well and rarely argued with her. But ever since Alan Peters appeared in their home, a dark streak had begun. Bill, Sandra, and Will called Adam a bad person who had destroyed a once happy and strong family. The police were interested in the white Ford Crown Victoria parked near the Inman's house. They confiscated the car's GPS navigator and checked the route. It turned out that on the afternoon of March 22nd, when the kidnapping occurred, the car was in Logan. In the evening at 5:30 p.m., the GPS was turned off and only turned back on the next morning, March 23rd, again in Logan. No evidence of the Inman's trip to Cleveland could be found. Moreover, according to telephone records, all night from March 22nd to 23, the suspects were in Logan. Then information came in that on the morning of March 23rd at 7:30 a.m., Bill, Sandra, and Will were seen at a car wash. They took the car for a full interior cleaning. Summer was not with them. After that, the Indians went to Cleveland where they changed tires at an auto repair shop. The mechanic found it strange that Bill decided to replace almost new tires with old ones. Allegedly, he simply didn't like the previous ones. The inmates also tried to change the appearance of the car. Bill removed the police spotlight he had once installed near the side mirror. After the arrest, Bill tried to convince his elderly mother that they were not guilty of anything and that these trials were God's punishment. However, after several hours of interrogation, realizing that all three of them faced the death penalty, Sandra gave in. The woman confessed that it was them who had kidnapped Summer on that fateful night. The men in balaclavas were her husband Bill and son Will. According to Sandra, the abduction was entirely her idea. She only wanted to scare her daughter-in-law so that she would allow Will to see the children. When Summer was pushed into the car, Will tied her hands, feet, and neck with plastic ties. The woman fought and screamed, and then suddenly fainted. Will noticed that Summer was showing no signs of life. He wanted to cut the bindings and free her. He shouted to his mother, "Mom, where's the knife? I can't find it." While the family was frantically searching for the knife, a few minutes passed. It was too late to save Summer as she had suffocated. Sandra swore they didn't want to kill their daughter-in-law, only to scare her in order to settle the custody dispute over the grandchildren and have the opportunity to see them at least on weekends. On March 29, 2011, a week after the abduction, Sandra showed where they had hidden the body. Summer was thrown into an abandoned well on the grounds of the church the Inman family attended. The Church of the Tabernacle of Faith is located near Nelsonville, 30 kilometers from the bank where Summer worked. Once, Bill Inman had participated in its construction. And 28 years ago, under the arches of this temple, he and Sandra got married. When the police lifted the concrete lid of the well, a gruesome sight met their eyes. Summer lay at the bottom, her body thrown in head first. The victim was wearing the same clothes as on the last day of her life, a black t-shirt with the words, "I don't have an anger problem. I have an idiot problem." The autopsy showed that Summer had died of strangulation. There were no other injuries on her body, except for marks from the plastic ties on her neck, wrists, and ankles. Sandra said that she had initially planned to throw the body into the river, but then she decided that in the church well, no one would definitely find it. The woman admitted her guilt and expressed sincere regret for what she had done. Soon, the trial took place. 49-year-old Bill and 28-year-old Bill did not plead guilty to Summer's murder. They barely spoke during the hearings and avoided looking her parents in the eye. Only Sandra repented for what she had done and tried to take all the responsibility upon herself. She repeated that the abduction was her idea. Delivering her final statement, the woman begged for forgiveness from Summer's parents through tears. Emotions were choking Sandra, but despite this, everyone understood that she sincerely regretted what had happened. Summer was like a daughter to me, the woman sobbed. If I could turn back time, I would never have taken this horrible step. In 2012, the court passed the sentence. Bill and Will Dingman received life imprisonment without the right to early release. Sandler was sentenced to life in prison with the right to parole after 15 years. The church friends and parishioners unanimously claimed that Bill was in charge of everything in the Inman family. He was the one making the decisions. No one believed that the idea of the kidnapping belonged to Sandra. Everyone knew that Will had been a spoiled boy since childhood, with his parents indulging his every whim. The defendant herself understood that her husband and son were just as guilty as she was. But Sandra tried to take the blame until the very end, hoping to soften their fate. Alex, Kaylee, and Alana remained under the care of Summer's deceased parents. For a long time, they could not explain to their grandchildren where their mother, father, grandmother, and grandfather had gone. The tragedy of the Inman family serves as a warning about how hidden anger, jealousy, and the desire to control someone else's life can lead to fatal consequences. Bill and Sandra, who were a model of piety and family values to everyone, turned out to be real tyrants to their daughter-in-law. Summer became a victim of a toxic relationship where her will and desires were suppressed, and attempts to break free cost her life. Will, raised in such a suffocating atmosphere, grew up selfish and unwilling to compromise. His obsession with the idea of getting his wife and children back at any cost ultimately turned against him. The Inman's terrible crime forever destroyed several families, deprived 3 small children of their mother, and a grandfather and grandmother of their closest person. On June 22, 2019, 73-year-old Eugene Joe embarked on a hike along the Mount Waterman Trail in the Angeles National Forest, California, with a group of friends. The group paused for lunch partway through their trek, but when they resumed, they realized Eugene was no longer with them. Unable to locate him on their own, the group alerted search and rescue authorities. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office coordinated with search and rescue teams from across the region, deploying 75 individuals divided into 11 teams to scour the rugged terrain of the San Gabriel Mountains. For a week, the search teams combed the wilderness, determined to find Eugene. On June 29th, members of the Altadena Mountain Rescue Team discovered Eugene in a ravine in Devil's Canyon around 11 a.m. Despite being in a weakened state after surviving 7 days in the wilderness, Eugene managed to summon the strength to turn himself over and call out for help after hearing searchers speaking with nearby campers. Eugene was airlifted to safety by a Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department air rescue helicopter and taken to Huntington Memorial Hospital in Pasadena. Remarkably, he had no major injuries from his ordeal, though his hiking boots bore the brunt of his time lost in the forest. His survival was a testament to resilience and the relentless efforts of the search teams. Eugene was weak, however, because he had not eaten anything in 5 days. He had quickly made sure to find a water source soon after getting lost, which probably saved his life. He had spent the week he was lost drinking water from the Devil's Canyon Creek and slept on rocks at night to keep warm. Eugene was discharged from the hospital the same day he arrived there. Eugene was thankful to have been rescued and grateful for all of the effort total strangers had put into finding him. He does not plan to continue hiking in the future. 35-year-old Amanda Eller worked as a yoga teacher and a physical therapist. She lived in Haiku, an unincorporated community on the island of Maui, with her boyfriend, Benjamin. On the morning of May 8, 2019, Amanda was meditating as Benjamin left for work at 7:30 a.m. She was not home when he returned from work, and she did not come home that night at all. Benjamin reported her missing early the following morning. Amanda's white Toyota RAV4 was found in the parking lot at the Makawao Forest Reserve at 9:50 a.m. on May 9th, the same morning she was reported missing. Her keys had been hidden under the front tire of the vehicle, and her cell phone and wallet were inside of it along with a pair of flip-flops. Amanda loved nature and was an avid runner, so it would not have been unusual for Amanda to have visited this location on her day off from work. It was initially assumed that Amanda had entered the forest around 8 a.m. on the morning of 8th based on eyewitness reports of a woman matching Amanda's description being in the parking lot around that time. This timeline came into question 5 days after Amanda went missing, when Amanda's parents, who had flown into Hawaii to help look for their daughter, received a phone call from their pet sitter. A Mother's Day package had just arrived at their home in Maryland from Amanda. Surveillance footage was eventually found of Amanda in a store purchasing the final items for the package at 10:11 on May 8th. She was wearing the flip-flops that had been found in her vehicle. She had printed off the label for the package at home and dropped the package off at the post office approximately 10 minutes after she had checked out of the store. The Maui Fire Department spent 3 days diligently searching for Amanda, but their official search was called off after 3 days, as was their procedure. Amanda's family, however, continued searching for her on their own thanks to the $77,000 they received in donations on GoFundMe and a massive outpouring of support from volunteers. During the course of the search, helicopters and drones searched for Amanda from the air. Divers searched nearby waterways, and volunteers and teams of search dogs searched on the ground. An average of 100 people searched for Amanda each day. On May 24th, 17 days after Amanda entered the forest, a volunteer helicopter pilot was just about to turn back after a search flight because he was going to run out of fuel. He received an instruction over the radio to make a wide right turn, which would take him over an area that had been outside of the official search area near the Kailua Reservoir, roughly 5 miles north of where Amanda had parked her vehicle. When he did, the volunteers on the flight with him spotted Amanda lying in a creek bed. Amanda was airlifted by the Maui Fire Department to Maui Medical Center, where she was reunited with her family. Amanda had lost 15 pounds and was suffering from severe sunburn, numerous bruises and cuts, and a broken tibia sustained after a 20-foot fall. Amanda was discharged from the hospital on May 26th to finish her recovery at home. According to Amanda, she had planned to spend a few hours in the forest on a 3-mile run. There had been a lot of trees down on the trail, so she decided to hike instead. She stopped to rest and meditate on a downed tree just off the trail at what she thought would have been the halfway point of her hike. When she got up to continue on, she believed she was heading back towards her car. She was not. Eventually, Amanda realized that she was no longer on the hiking trail, but on a boar trail that was taking her further away from the parking lot. She tried to use her intuition to make her way back, but got more and more disoriented instead. Amanda had previously read a book on native Hawaiian plants, which helped her identify what fruits she came across were edible. There had been several days where she had been unable to find any food at all. She had come across a creek about a week into her ordeal, which she traveled along so that she would be near a source of water. Amanda had heard helicopters fly overhead almost 20 times during her time in the forest, but the vegetation was too thick for anyone in the helicopters to see her trying to get their attention. At a press conference on May 28th, Amanda described her time in the forest as spiritual boot camp and spoke of her experience largely in terms of the role her spirituality played in it. Some people interpreted these statements to mean that Amanda had intentionally gone off the trail as some sort of spiritual journey. Amanda filmed a video, released on the Facebook page, that had been set up to coordinate the search for her to clarify what had happened and give a detailed account of how she had gotten lost. She had simply been too focused on the spiritual lessons she could take away from the time she had been lost rather than on the factual details of her experience at the press conference. Amanda acknowledged that it had been irresponsible to go into the forest without her cell phone and apologized for potentially putting members of the search parties in danger by getting lost. She also thanked everyone who had been a part of the search effort and expressed gratitude for the outpouring of support she and her family had received from all over the world. Amanda's family has plans to use the remaining money raised through GoFundMe to install wilderness cameras in the Makawao Forest Reserve and other remote recreational areas on Maui to help speed up any further search and rescue operations. Amanda's father, John, is also planning to help develop an app for search and rescue workers through his company, Insight Mobile Data. 48-year-old Jerry Dragoo was having a difficult 1994. The high school superintendent from Taft, California, had lost his 18-year-old son, Matthew, in a car accident that May. Jerry had a lifelong love of the outdoors and decided to take a trip to Yosemite National Park at the beginning of August to help him cope with his loss. On Monday, August 1st, Jerry camped in his car near the Levitt Lake trailhead just north of the park. He had plans to spend 2 days hiking alone before meeting up with one of his cousins at Bigelow Lake. When Jerry's wife Leslie called his cousin on August 6th, she learned that Jerry had never shown up for the planned meeting. The search for Jerry began the next day with searchers working on the ground and helicopters searching from the air. The standard 3 days of searching passed, but the search team did not scale back their efforts, even though that was the protocol at the time. Instead, they tried a different approach. Dog trainers Mike Bigelow and Terry Buttram, along with Mike's 2-year-old Australian Shepherd Ranger, boarded a helicopter. The trio was dropped off at Dorothy Lake near Forsyth Peak. They began heading higher up the mountain when Ranger suddenly began running back down. He soon ran back to Mike and Terry and sat down in front of them, which was his signal that he had found someone. Mike and Terry followed Ranger to a large boulder. Behind it, they found Jerry. On August 4th, Jerry had been unable to find his cousin at their pre-arranged meeting place. Jerry then decided to go up on a ridge by himself to build a small memorial for Matthew, who had shared his love of the outdoors. Jerry had tripped and fallen 25 feet head first, which resulted in a large gash on his forehead, 6 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and a broken ankle. Unable to move very much due to his injuries, Jerry rationed his trail mix and drank lake water for the following several days. He only had a light rain jacket to keep him warm. It is believed that he would have passed away within hours had he not been found and transported to a hospital. As a result of Jerry's rescue, California's Office of Emergency Services expanded their intensive search period from 3 to 7 days. At least 3 people were located and rescued during this extended time window in the first 15 years following its institution. Jerry suffered a severe heart attack in 2002 and received a heart transplant on Christmas Eve of that year, his late surgeon donning a Santa hat. He passed away on April 3, 2015 at the age of 69. His rescue in 1994 gave him 20 extra years with his wife and daughter and eventually his son-in-law and 2 grandchildren. 58-year-old Kevin Lynch of Woodbridge, New Jersey traveled to Waynesville, North Carolina to attend a family reunion with his wife, Elena, in July 2019. The reunion was being held at the Swag Resort, which borders the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Kevin went missing from the resort on July 27th. He was last seen around 3:20 in the afternoon walking along the border of the resort property near the Cataloochee Divide Trail before disappearing from sight. Kevin's disappearance was an emergency from the start because he suffered from dementia. Both Hayward County Emergency Management and the National Park Service aggressively began searching for Kevin, hoping that he had not made it very far into the heavily wooded area. Unfortunately, their early efforts were not successful and the search effort had to continue to grow over the following few days. More than 200 people from 32 different agencies participated in the physical search for Kevin, and more than 60 agencies contributed to the effort in one way or another. Search teams of 10 individuals each covered overgrown and steep terrain as part of a grid search that covered a 5-mile radius out from where Kevin had last been seen. They also posted flyers and interviewed any hikers they came across in hopes that they had seen Kevin. Law enforcement went door to door informing the residents of homes along the border of the national park of Kevin's disappearance and asking them to keep a lookout for him. Helicopters, drones, and search dogs were all utilized in the search. The search effort went from sunup till sundown every day. It would not be until July 31st that the search team found their first clues. That afternoon, the hat and sunglasses Kevin had been wearing were discovered approximately 1,600 feet southeast of the Catalucci Divide Trail. Nearby, they found footprints and mud that had been created by a recent rain shower that went towards the Ferguson cabin, a historic cabin that the National Park Service maintains. Kevin was not found in the cabin, but these clues helped focus the search effort. At 4:25 that afternoon, Kevin was found in the woods when he responded to a group of searchers calling out his name. He was described as being alert and responsive when he was found. He was less than a mile from where he had last been seen in an area that had previously been searched. Kevin suffered no serious injuries during the time he was lost, but was transported to Haywood Regional Medical Center to be treated for dehydration. Kevin's lack of injuries outside of scrapes and bruises was surprising given the fact that he had no supplies with him when he went into the woods, and he had been dressed in just a t-shirt and shorts. He was released from the hospital on August 2nd. Given Kevin's dementia, it was not possible to get a complete account of his time while he was missing. His family is happy enough knowing that he is now safe. They issued a press release thanking everyone who participated in the extensive search effort. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.